Here we are about midway through the quarter. Also, just as a public service announcement, just in case anybody wants to pick one up early, I don't know how quickly Richard passes these things out, but these books are here for the next quarter, so if you want to get a jump on it as far as looking into the leader materials and whatnot, they are available. Contact Richard. I won't tell you where the secret stash is, so that way people don't go rat pilfering his supplies, and of course he'll know the person who let that cat out of the bag, but nonetheless, they are here, so now that I have my hands on this about a month ahead of what I normally get, then maybe I can try to be a bit more on time with releasing all this information right before the quarter starts, which is what I'm always aiming to try to do. But again, I was only able to get a digital copy about a month in advance until Richard told me we were actually getting them sent here almost 2 months in advance. So now that we're good there, then hopefully we can make this roll a little smoother. All right, so here we are. Book of Esther, and this is our only chance to really get a glimpse at this book. So, of course, if you have read it or you've heard some sermons from it, you're probably quite familiar with what the overall gist of the book is. Obviously, the people are still in exile. So from where we've been in recent weeks with respect to our looks into Ezra and so forth, we started with Daniel, people still in exile, looked on into Ezra, now people have left exile. Last week we were in Zechariah, again post-exilic, but with Esther, here we are still back somewhat in the exile, but the people have been allowed to go back to their land. So what I'm saying is more or less we're shifting our panoramic view away from being in the Holy Land in Jerusalem, now all the way back to Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, with Esther, Mordecai, Jews that are still living there, choosing not yet to go back to their homeland. So with that being said, retitling this lesson from the people rescued to something very similar, and that being a focus on the Exodus in Esther. Now, as I talk about this, hopefully you're not rolling your eyes, and the reason being is because, no doubt, this is the theme that I probably come back to most frequently, but the reason is, again, because this is probably the most prevalent theme in all of Scripture that unites solidly all of the canonical material from Genesis through Revelation, and it's a theme that we continue to see do more than just stick its head up like a periscope of a submarine out of water to then go back down. It's very bold and it's in your face in almost every book of the Bible in some way, shape, or form. And so in order for us to really understand the full impact of what's going on in the New Testament, salvifically with respect to the story of the gospel, the announcement of the kingdom and the arrival of the king, what plays out as part of that great drama is the fact that exile is coming to its end, which means Exodus is on its horizon. And we're actually at the beginning stages of that. One thing I've tried to help us perhaps understand a little bit better over these last 4 to 5 weeks is the fact that as we're entering into this post-exilic period, which is about 5 centuries before Jesus' birth, we're beginning a period of time here that sees its culmination with Jesus' arrival, right? And so much of this time, of course, is excised for us out of the canon of Scripture. More ancient generations of Christians were usually using books such as the Maccabees and so forth. Such as the Maccabees and Tobit and so forth, for the sake of ultimately trying to understand a bit more about that intertestamental period between Malachi and the writings of the Gospels. And while we as Protestants, for the most part, don't consider those books to be, thank you, Richard, divinely inspired, they still provide us quite a bit of historical information with respect to what's going on there. And of course, there are several other sources of literature that we would lump in the pile as Second Temple literary works. So books that pertain to the Apocrypha, Maccabees and so forth, or the Pseudepigrapha, strictly Jewish works that have never really been considered to be part of Christian history or canon, are great resources for us to be able to read, to understand what's going on in that world between Malachi and the beginning of the gospel accounts. And it really helps us shape up a lot of the theology that's going on in Jesus' day with respect to where do synagogues come from, the different sects of Judaism, Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, and so forth. And so with that, we're getting a peek now at the beginning of what God was promising was going to happen with the arrival of the Messianic age. And the arrival of the Messianic age has actually already dawned here in this post-exilic window. But it does not come to the full moment when the sun has come up over the horizon and is now high in the sky until Jesus comes. So Jesus caps off this moment with his crucifixion on Passover weekend. And just like the Passover ends the Exodus in Egypt, so does Jesus' death coinciding with Passover signify the end of exile, and the whole world is coming out of their chains, their bondage, in, quote, the Egypt of their sin, with the birth of, perhaps we might call it the Christian era, certainly the church, the renewal of Israel with the cutting off of natural branches that reject Messiah, the grafting in of wild branches, signifying the Gentile nations that are coming in alongside them. And that agrees with the writings of pre-exilic and post-exilic prophets. So all of this is leading us up to that moment. It's just a tidal wave that's building more momentum until it all comes crashing down with a clear window and a clear picture here of what all this was ultimately leading to. So all that shabby introduction to just kind of get us to this point as an understanding of why I'm really choosing to point out this material here in Esther for the sake of making sure we understand this Exodus pattern is front and center. And the only book of Scripture that doesn't even mention the name of God, yet the greatest story that identifies God for who he is and his relationship to his covenant people is, again, front and center with respect to this book. So most of that material is going to be on the right side of the screen, and it's a little bit of a jumbled order, and the reason why is because in walking this pattern out, it's important for us to frame it up in two of the places where it stands out the most in the previous books of Scripture, the story of Abraham and the story of the Exodus itself in the book of Exodus with respect to Israel being in Egypt and then coming out of that exile through the Exodus that begins there. But to walk out the pattern, we need to appreciate that some of those details are a little jumbled. So you might be thinking, well, how am I going to teach this then? Well, consider the passages that we're in chapters 3 and chapter 8. The material that you're actually looking at in chapter 3 begins with a plan concocted by Haman to want to destroy the Jews. And then what we find in chapter 8 is what happens after Esther is able to gain favor with her husband the king, all because the Lord has, of course, dealt with his heart and given him a favorable disposition to this woman he's recently acquired as his wife and now coronated as his queen, to then listen to the plight that she is desperate to try to help seek some measure of resolution for, and that is the plan that Haman had concocted. And, of course, at this point, he has duped the king into putting a law into place that, according to the Persians, cannot be redacted by the king. It has to be enacted. Only another law can be passed that would either undercut or undermine in some way, which is ultimately what happens to allow the Jews to be able to defend themselves and rescue themselves from what Haman's wicked plan was, which was ultimately their destruction. When you think about it in terms like that, we are basically just changing out names and places and going right back to the original Exodus story that happens in Scripture. Okay, so to see this pattern play out, hopefully you as a teacher have a copy of the material, because I've sent that slideshow out to most, if not all of you. So instead of me enlarging it on the screen, you might want to pull that up on a computer or something like that to be able to see it just a wee bit better. So on the far left side of the screen is the actual pattern itself. Sorry. There we go. Finally got the technology cooperating with us. So in defining the pattern, the first thing we see here is that with any exile-exodus cycle, the exile period itself is defined by a threat being present or is brought about by some sort of sin that was committed. In the story of Abraham that starts in Genesis chapter 12, after months, years of waiting and actually going through the phasic journey of leaving Mesopotamia, coming to present-day Syria and settling briefly in the city of Haran, and then finally migrating westward into the land of Canaan. As soon as he gets there, he arrives at the worst possible time. There's a famine, so he chooses to leave the land. And he's supposed to settle there because he's supposed to inherit all that place, but he chooses to just keep going south and walks right into the land of Egypt. And that, of course, is going to create problems. So a famine is a threat, and then in the book of Exodus itself, we have the Egyptians who have now chosen to look with disdain and no longer favor toward these Semites who have settled amongst them and have been there for several generations, rather than seeing them as the people that God chose to use to save them from the terrible famine in the days of Joseph. Now they see them as an expendable workforce that is also a threat to them because they rival them in number. So they choose to set taskmasters over them and enslave them and rob them of their dignity. Well, in Esther, this is exactly where this story starts for us in chapter 3. Haman, the Agagite, has concocted a plan to destroy all of the Jews. Now, of course, there's a backstory to that. Perhaps you may already be aware of that, but just briefly, we should be aware of the fact Haman, called an Agagite, descends directly from the king Agag, who in the days of Samuel and Saul was head over this nomadic people wandering throughout the southern deserts below Judah in the Negev. And this was God's plan from the days of Moses and Joshua all the way up until this moment. As God had told Joshua, write this down in the book, the Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now the time had come to dispense of these people, to destroy every trace of them. Saul was told that. This was his redemptive moment, but he failed in that, destroying most of their warriors, leaving their king alive as something of a spoil of war. And Samuel denounced Saul as king, told him this moment God has taken the kingdom from him, given it to another, totally rejected Saul as king. And then Samuel went to killing Agag himself. Well, in leaving some of those people alive, Haman, or his ancestors apparently, were rushed off into a safe haven of sorts, and then eventually Haman's people find themselves living in Persia. And of course, Haman is elevated to a position like Joseph was in that kingdom. Obviously not Egypt. It's the Persian Empire. And now he becomes the existential threat to the Jewish people, and probably never would have had Saul been obedient to start with. Nonetheless, then we go back to the pattern. Eve, now I should put quotations around Eve here, but Eve is assaulted by the serpent. So of course that context is created for us in Genesis chapter 3. Eve should have been protected by Adam, but she was left vulnerable for the serpent to dupe. And because Adam was close by and chose to do nothing, ultimately that leads to the predicament of what happens in Genesis 3. Well, Eve, as an archetype of sorts, is picked up in several other stories. In Abraham's story, Sarah, originally Sarai, is the Eve to the new Adam, that being Abram, who is beginning this new creation story for God's covenant people. As soon as Abram arrives in Egypt, what does Pharaoh assume to do? But because of Sarah's great beauty, chooses to take her into his household to become his wife. That's a huge problem, is it not? Because she is supposed to be the vessel through whom this promised child will come. Now, those details haven't been divulged to us yet in the story, but God says he's going to make a great name of Abraham and a father of many nations, and of course multiply his seed, so that must mean it will come through Sarah. The reader should be able to easily pick up on that. How's that going to happen, though, if she's now just another woman in Pharaoh's harem, and Abram at some point is going to leave the land without her because Pharaoh is certainly not going to give her back up? We go to the story of Exodus, where the people are locked away, and here we have the strict orders given by Pharaoh to the Hebrew midwives that when the children are born, if they have sons, then the midwives are to put them to death. And if there are daughters, then they would be allowed to live. Ultimately, for the sake of perhaps breeding out the Hebrew lineage by killing sons but saving daughters, still using them as slave labor force, but at the same time, perhaps marrying them off as wives to other Egyptian native-born men, and eventually, after successive iterations of breeding, then eventually those Hebrew people would no longer exist. Either way, we go to the book of Esther. Here in chapter 7, so this becomes before chapter 8, part of our text, setting up the context for the conversation between Esther and the king in chapter 8. Here we have, starting in chapter 5 through 7, Esther's own plan that has some deception kind of mixed into it, right? Playing at Haman's own game, which was to create a banquet to honor both the king and his second in command, Haman. And in the process of it all, she would divulge to the king what Haman had done and catch Haman off guard and hopefully be able to have the king exercise judgment upon him. So in the moment the king finds out what's going on, he is enraged at this, steps away from the table. Haman scoots close to the queen. He's pleading for his life. Apparently the king is out of earshot, cannot hear what's being said, turns back to see what's going on, sees that Haman has closed the distance between himself and Esther, and the king asks the question, would he actually violate the queen? Meaning that Esther, the Eve of this story, is in some way in danger here, at least in the eyes of her protective husband, Adam, because of the wicked serpentine Haman who was attempting to try to decimate Esther and her people. And Haman, of course, had no idea Esther was actually Jewish, but nonetheless, she is caught up in his trap and now trying to wriggle herself free by the use of her husband. So deceptive tactics, we've kind of hinted at, are used to ensure survival. Abraham did the same thing. Why was Sarai grabbed up by Pharaoh to become a part of his harem? Well, he was afraid that Pharaoh would kill him for the sake of taking this woman, so he had Sarah make sure to tell everyone that she is his sister rather than wife. That's truthful, but the lie of omission is really what's being deceptive here. Of course, when we go to the story of Exodus, we kind of have a little bit of a ploy like that, with Moses going before Pharaoh saying, let my people go out into the wilderness on a 3-day journey to hold a festival unto our God. This might be a little loose as far as the interpretation goes, but I would suggest that with Moses doing that and offering Pharaoh the chance to allow the people to leave, even under the auspice of this only being temporary, there would be no plan for the people to come back into the land and resume their place as slaves. Obviously, Pharaoh's heart would be hardened and he wouldn't accept this, but let's just play the other side of that coin. What would have happened if Pharaoh did? Would Moses have brought the people back? We don't know. That part of the story isn't written. But I think in this we can see that there's some measure of deception here for the sake of attempting to try to gain freedom or end the threat. Now, when I say that, you might have your feathers ruffled a little bit. You might think, well, it makes it sound like you're actually justifying in a righteous way deceptive ploys that are actually something that's accomplishing good rather than bad. I don't really have time to go into this kind of theme that plays out in Scripture, but I would say there are instances where these kinds of things actually happen and are used in a good way, and these are just a small sampling of those stories. That would be worth a study on its own. But I say that, calling it out for what it is, so that hopefully you don't turn me off at this point and decide not to listen to the rest of this. So Esther is doing the same thing. As I've already mentioned, she has concocted a plan to draw the king and Haman into a banquet that she's thrown for them. The idea is, of course, to actually draw out Haman into a vulnerable position where the king sees the scheme for what it is, how it threatens the queen above all else, to force the king to make a judgment call on what is he going to do, either avenge his wife and, by proxy, her people, or allow Haman's plan to stand, which would ultimately wind up threatening Esther as well. So Yahweh plagues the tyrant. That's another key theme in this Exodus pattern. Go back to the story of Abraham. So the moment that Sarai is brought into Pharaoh's harem, God strikes the land with plagues. Obviously, the entirety of the story of Exodus in the first half of the book is all about how God is striking the land of Egypt with all of his wonders or miracles through 10 successive plagues, growing in escalation up until the death of the firstborn. But we actually have something very akin going on to what happens here, because when the king finally judges Haman and then hears Mordecai's plea and Esther's to try to undo Haman's plan, he tells them, look, you know this is how the law amongst the Persians works. I cannot take back what I've done, but I will give you authority, basically passing on to Mordecai the very authority that Haman wielded, which was using the king's signet ring, bearing the king's authority to draft a law that would, of course, be binding. That is the plan by which the Jews will now have free recourse to do whatever they have to do to be able to defend themselves, even killing Persian citizens, if Persians would attempt to try to accomplish what Haman wanted, which was decimating the Jews and plundering them. So when the day finally comes, the Jews do wind up putting their enemies to the sword. So God brings judgment upon wicked Gentiles who are a threat to his covenant people by arming the Jews to be able to kind of, in a sense, act like Joshua in the days of the holy wars of Canaan, and not just simply exact vengeance, but protect his remnant that is in the land. Because if we situate this appropriately, we must understand there are Jews who have resettled in Jerusalem and in the Persian province of Judah, have rebuilt this temple and city. So that is probably the epicenter of where this conflict is at. If we look back to the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, we can clearly see there are plenty of people like your Sanballat and Tobiah who hate the Jews and are going to do whatever they can to try to undermine their success. Now, this is music to their ears. Haman has given them a chance to actually take up sword and shield against them, to slaughter them, and nothing will happen to them. The king will not send military forces to that area to exact vengeance on those who picked a fight with their regional enemies. So now they're probably going to attempt to try to overthrow Jerusalem. But the people who live in Jerusalem are actually going to be able to defend themselves quite amply without recourse either. In the end, Yahweh blesses his people. So even though Abraham lied and he more or less was not fully faithful to the Lord in going to Egypt in the first place, yet he winds up walking out of there in spite of that with flocks and herds and greatly enriched, more so than he was when he wound up going there in the first place. Same thing with the original Exodus story, because on their way out the night of the Passover, their Egyptian neighbors are giving them trinkets of gold and silver and clothes, basically begging them, paying them off to get out of the land before their God turns his eye toward them and kills all of them now that he's taken their firstborn children. Well, again, Jews put their enemies to the sword. Now, in Esther, it says that they did not take spoils from among them. It seems, though, that the connotation there is that they did not personally plunder them for the sake of taking their property and taking it into their own homes. But Ezekiel may give us a little bit of an inclination as to what may have happened here, in that they took the spoils from those they killed and brought them to the temple and added it to the temple treasuries. We'll get to that momentarily. Back to the pattern. So Yahweh seems to interject himself in these great Exodus stories through dream patterns, because at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had had a dream. So let me see here. Let me actually check this scripture reference. Give me just a quick second. Genesis 41, 1. Yes, I'm sorry. I was confused for a second there as to, I don't remember the Pharaoh and Abraham story having a dream. This actually fast forwards us into the beginning of the Exodus cycle that ends with Moses and the people leaving, but it started with Joseph in the land. So this is the beginning of the Joseph story. And of course, in the Joseph story, that Pharaoh has the dream of the 7 cows and the 7 ears of corn, both fat and lean, and one gobbling up the other, signifying famine was going to come. And of course, with this, it begins the process of Israel's migration down into the land, and eventually, 400 years later, their exit out of there. We don't really have something like that going on with respect to the Exodus story in the days of Moses, but then again, that's the culmination of this Genesis 41 moment. Here, back in Ezra or Esther's story, we have that particular king actually having a dream. So in the midst of all of this, he has allowed Haman to actually do what it was that he desired, and this is going to exact Haman's vengeance upon the Jewish people with Mordecai as the chief target, because he won't bow the knee to Haman. But the Lord does not allow the king to have a restful night's sleep one night, so he wakes up, and for some reason he wants the archives searched, and he finds out that Mordecai actually had saved his life from an assassination plot. And so because of that, he wanted to make sure that Mordecai was properly honored, and he actually asks Haman what Haman would do for someone the king wanted to honor. Thinking it was himself, he gives a grandiose plan, and then he tells Haman, go and do this for Mordecai, because of the fact that he had saved the king's life. And of course, this speeds up the idea or the plan that Haman wants to enact, but in the end, it winds up saving the Jews rather than destroying them. Back to the pattern. The tyrant has a tendency to want to blame shift to Yahweh's people. So in the Pharaoh story of Abraham's day, the question then becomes, what have you done to me? So Pharaoh, seeing the plagues that God has smote Egypt with, is now confronting Abram as if to say it's Abram's fault, which of course Abram does have a role to play, and he is somewhat at fault. But that should not hold Pharaoh guiltless for the fact that he is just amassing women for his own sexual pleasure and desire. That's not according to God's original plan. And just because Pharaoh is not a part of God's covenant people, which at this moment in the story, there is no covenant people. It's just the covenant person, Abram, and his wife by extension, Sarai, is covered underneath that. But nonetheless, this is God's plan for all the sons and daughters of Adam, of which Pharaoh is one. So Pharaoh is no more guiltless in this than Abram is. And then when we move over to the Egypt or the Exodus story itself, while the people are in Egypt, here we have Pharaoh being confronted by Moses. But when he's told to let the people go, here we have Pharaoh basically accusing Moses in this statement, you are causing the people to neglect their work. And so then he, of course, increases the quota for how many bricks have to be made, removes some of the resources, and, of course, gives allowance for the taskmasters to punish the people all the more for not being able to make their quotas of both bricks and building projects. And he blames all of this on Moses. So we have the same thing going on here with wicked Haman. So he is trying to convince the king for the reason why he wants to put this law into place, that there is one particular group of people under the king's rule who have always been a very rebellious people, and if the king doesn't do something now, sorry about that, if the king doesn't do something now to try to end this threat, then ultimately what's going to happen is these people in their rebellion are going to become a great thorn in the side for the king. And so the king is like, well, I definitely don't want that. And so what does he do? He gives Haman the power necessary to be able to destroy the people. Haman is blame shifting over to the Israelites themselves, justifying what's going to come. All right, a few more points here. In the end, Yahweh winds up humiliating the false gods. Of course, this is the reason for the pattern of judgment against all the idols in Egypt that happens through the last and final plague when God brings the ultimate hammer of judgment down upon those gods. And he says as much when he is speaking through Moses to the people, when he says, tonight I will execute judgment against the gods. Haman has basically vaunted himself as something of a god, and so Haman becomes the target of God's wrath, ultimately as an example to all of what will happen if someone raises himself up against God's people. And it's not just Haman, but it's even the members of his family as well. So Haman had described for them all the glorious wealth that he had amassed, again, as if to say that he has become almost a god in human form. Of course, he never calls himself that, but if you consider the pattern, that's what he's kind of elevated to become. And again, Yahweh judges him. Yahweh's people are then attacked by Amalek. And to me, this is probably one of the stronger points of the many we've already made, but it's not coincidental that we find this pattern actually in the story as well. We don't have that in the Genesis 12 story with Abram, but when we move on to the actual Exodus story with Moses and the people, as soon as they come out of Egypt, they are attacked by Amalek out in the wilderness. And this is the moment when this actual big drama between Amalek and Israel starts. And of course, now it's finished with Haman, the descendant of Agag, the actual last Amalekite king mentioned in Scripture, is the one who winds up being killed. And then lastly, Yahweh's people are installed in the Holy Land. So Abram, after he leaves Egypt, finally goes to settle in Hebron. After Israel winds up leaving Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, and then through Joshua, they wind up crossing the Jordan to be settled. Now here I've chosen a passage from Ezekiel 39. This is probably a less known opinion, and of course that means it's kind of held in contention. Not everybody necessarily agrees with this, but then again, there's only ever consensuses on most things in Scripture except for the chief core central doctrines of Christian faith. But a person by the name of Gary DeMar, I would encourage you to research his opinion on this, has postulated that Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, what we often may refer to as the war of Gog and Magog, many people under dispensationalism and so forth have been taught this is a yet future war to be fought. But Gary, and there seems to be a growing consensus leaning in that direction, is describing that this particular war may have actually been what was occurring in the book of Esther when the Jews and all of their surrounding enemies from the different people groups were sparring against one another, and of course, life and death hung in the balance. That was the reference I made earlier about halfway through this lesson, that while the people did not take personal spoil, nonetheless, they did loot their enemies and may have actually taken the spoil to the house of the Lord already built in Jerusalem at that particular time, and they added it to the treasuries there as dedication over to Yahweh, which fits the pattern of what has happened so many times before in these holy wars that have occurred when these peoples have been looted. So to come to the end here, what I would say is, while that's many details, what's important to make sure we understand is that the story of Esther, above all, is not a love story between a man and a woman, king, queen, or even necessarily God's provision, as goes how he just continues to be faithfully and good to these people without proper context, and that is God's providence. God is leading them and continuing to shepherd them in this newly arrived messianic window of time when Messiah is anticipated to show up. These people are living with doubt and fear as to when it's going to come. Now an edict, a law has been passed that declares open season on them, that anyone can kill them, and there's little to nothing they can do about it. But then God shows up through people working in the capital city, like a Joseph, like a Moses, facing down pharaohs and kings of the like, and are receiving benevolence from one king while another pharaoh-like figure, Haman, is trying to destroy them. And in the process of it all, God protects his people, destroys the enemies who posture themselves against his kingdom, and by virtue of that, he shows his goodness, and of course, that at some point he's going to bring to fruition all that he promised through the mouth, the words of his prophets. So I hope that's helpful. Any questions from the audience? Well, if not, thank you for your time.